The winter of 1968 arrived earlier than anyone in Borum County had anticipated. By the second week of November, frost had already sealed the mornings, and the tops of the pines on Hollow Ridge shimmered like rows of pale glass needles. Locals had long spoken about Hollow Ridge in the way people discuss places they secretly dread, in a tone caught somewhere between warning and superstition. Hunters steered clear of it. Hikers kept their distance from its tree line. Even the county's search and rescue teams refused to venture in after dark. But on the morning of November 14, 1968, everything shifted. The hikers who should have turned back. The discovery began with a group of 3 friends from the neighboring town of Lockford: Samuel Jennings, Maria Trent, and Leonard Lenny Holbrook. They weren't thrill seekers or ghost hunters. Just weekend hikers wary of the usual trails, who had decided to push deeper into the county's more untouched woods. Samuel was the first to suggest Hollow Ridge. Maria immediately shook her head. "Everyone says that place messes with your sense of direction," she warned, tightening her scarf. Lenny laughed it off. "A forest is a forest. Old stories don't scare me." But even Samuel, who had proposed the idea, later admitted that something about the ridge felt wrong the moment they crossed its boundary, marked by an old rust-colored forestry sign warning hikers to turn back. The forest inside the ridge was unusually quiet, not silent, just wrong. The wind blew, but the branches didn't sway. Birds chirped, but the echoes didn't travel. Even their footsteps seemed swallowed by the moss-covered ground. "Feels like walking inside a soundproof room," Maria whispered. The first sign something was watching. The deeper they walked, the more the forest seemed to shift. Subtly but undeniably. Maria kept catching movement in the corner of her eye, a flickering shadow behind a fallen tree, or the flash of pale fabric disappearing behind a trunk. Lenny dismissed it. "Probably deer," he said, but Maria wasn't convinced. "Deer don't watch you, deer run." At one point, all 3 of them stopped at the exact same moment. Not because they saw something, but because they felt something. A pressure, like dense air, or a sound too low to hear. It vibrated behind their ears, subtle but persistent. Samuel rubbed his hairline. "Anybody else feel that?" "Like a hum." Lenny nodded but brushed it off. "We're probably near a power line or something." There were no power lines in Hollow Ridge, the glade that shouldn't have been there. After several miles, the group stumbled into a clearing. Later, investigators would note that this clearing did not appear on any forestry maps before 1968, and would not appear again after the incident. It was a perfect circle, not a natural one, but unnervingly clean and symmetrical, as if carved by something with intention. The grass inside was dead, brittle, and completely flattened, as though something enormous had once rested there. At the exact center stood a single object, a small wooden carving tied to a low branch with frayed rope. It resembled a child, but deformed, elongated, with exaggerated limbs and a hollow space where its face should be. Maria took 2 steps back. "No, we're going back." But before they could leave, they heard a cough. A small, weak, unmistakably human cough coming from somewhere behind the trees. The sound of a child who had been cold for far too long. Samuel froze. Maria covered her mouth. Then came another sound. Not a cough, but a whisper. A soft, rhythmic chanting, like syllables looped in an eerie pattern. "Loo, Lenny." Unknowingly, Lenny stepped closer to the edge of the clearing. "Is someone out there?" "Hello." No answer. The chant stopped abruptly, replaced by the distant sound of hurried footsteps, light, fast, frantic, like someone running barefoot through the undergrowth. And then the woods went quiet again. The first child appears. It happened so suddenly that none of them understood it at first. Maria let out a trembling gasp, pointing toward a cluster of dark pines. "There," she whispered. There by the roots, a small figure stood partially hidden between two tree trunks. At first glance, it looked like a child no older than 8 or 9. But the longer they stared, the stranger the details became. The child wasn't dressed for winter. Barefoot, legs covered in dirt, wearing a thin, torn tunic made of fabric none of them recognized. Woven and irregular, more like something handmade from reeds or fibers than modern cloth. But it was the face that chilled them. The child's expression was blank, not sad, not frightened, just empty, as if they were seeing humans for the first time and didn't know what expression to choose. Maria tried a gentle approach. "We're not going to hurt you. Are you lost?" The child tilted its head slowly, mechanically, and then spoke. Not in English, not in any language they recognized. It was a sequence of short syllables repeated twice. "Shalom. Shalom." Lenny swallowed hard. "Kid, we don't understand. Are you alone? Where are your parents?" The child blinked once, a long, deliberate blink, then raised an arm and pointed deeper into the woods. And then, as if on cue, 2 more figures stepped into view. The 3 children of Hollow Ridge. 3 children, all barefoot. All dressed in the same strange primitive tunics, and all staring with the same stillness. The kind of stillness that doesn't belong to children. Samuel took a step back. "Okay, this is not normal. We need to call someone." But none of their radios had a signal. Not a crackle, not even static. Just silence. The children slowly approached, 1 step at a time, stopping only when they were less than 10 feet away. Maria noticed something unusual. Something subtle but haunting. None of the children seemed to be breathing. Their chests didn't rise or fall. Not once, not even slightly. "Kids," Maria whispered, her voice trembling. "Are you all right?" The smallest child, a boy with tangled hair and wide, blackened pupils, extended his hand not toward them, but toward the wooden carving hanging from the tree in the clearing behind the hikers. He pointed at it and repeated another phrase, "Oro Shahalan. Oro Shahalan." Lenny's voice cracked. "What does that mean?" Samuel didn't answer, because he didn't have time to. The collapse. The moment the smallest child finished speaking, he collapsed silently, like a puppet whose strings had been cut. The other 2 children dropped moments later, bodies limp, eyes rolling back. Maria screamed and ran forward. "Oh my God! Oh, they're freezing!" They were. Their skin was ice cold, colder than the winter air around them. Samuel knelt beside one of them. Their pulses are slow, like barely there. Lenny hovered, panicking. "We have to get help." But Maria didn't move. She was staring at something behind the children's collapsed bodies. Something she hadn't noticed before. Their footprints. There weren't any. Not a single footprint in the snow or dusted dirt, as if they had appeared out of nowhere. The children wake. Before they could process what was happening, the children suddenly inhaled. A sharp, unified gasp, as if all 3 shared one set of lungs and someone had just flipped a switch. Their eyes opened at the exact same time. Maria stumbled backward. "What is happening?" The children sat upright in perfect synchronization and looked toward the hikers. Not with confusion, not with fear, but with an eerie calmness. The oldest child pointed at Samuel's backpack, specifically the metal compass attached to the strap. The compass needle had been spinning wildly since they entered the clearing. The child whispered something softly, almost pleadingly. "Me no, my." Samuel felt his throat tighten. What do you want?" The child didn't answer. Instead, he lifted his hand and placed it gently on Samuel's wrist. His touch was cold enough to burn. And then Samuel heard it, not out loud, but inside his head a whisper, not human, not natural, something like a thought that didn't belong to him. "Help us, before it returns." He jerked his arm away, stumbling back. Did anyone else hear that? Maria nodded slowly, her eyes wide with terror. I did. But the child didn't speak. Lenny grabbed Samuel's arm. We need to leave right now. But it was too late. The sound that changed everything. From deep within Hollow Ridge came a noise. Low, vibrating, almost like the hum of an enormous machine buried underground. The trees trembled. The ground seemed to pulse. Even the air thickened, vibrating with an unnatural resonance. The children reacted instantly. Their faces twisted in fear, the first real emotion they'd shown. They scrambled to their feet, clutching one another, shaking violently. The youngest child looked up at Maria with wide, terrified eyes and spoke in broken English for the first time. It comes. Maria's voice cracked. What comes? Before the child could answer, every bird in the forest exploded into flight at once. Thousands of wings beating against the sky. And then, without warning, the children bolted deeper into the woods, running faster than any child should have been able to run. Samuel yelled after them, but they were gone in seconds. The hum grew louder. The trees groaned. The forest seemed to tilt. The hikers didn't chase the children. They ran in the opposite direction, harder than they had ever run in their lives. The call to authorities. By the time they stumbled out of Hollow Ridge and reached the nearest ranger outpost, Samuel was shaking, Maria was crying, and Lenny could barely speak. The rangers didn't believe them at first, until they led a search team back to the clearing. The wooden carving was still there, swinging lightly in the breeze. But the children were nowhere to be found. At least not until the search party reached the far edge of the ridge, where the 3 barefoot children were finally found, standing silently beside an abandoned logging road, staring at the rescuers with blank, unblinking eyes. When the rescuers approached, the oldest child spoke softly, Shalom Mayan. Later, linguists, historians, anthropologists, and folk tradition experts would all try to decode those words. None ever succeeded, because whatever language the children spoke, it didn't come from Hollow Ridge. It didn't come from Borum County. The Hollow Ridge region had always carried the weight of forgotten history, but by 1968, most people in Borum County only remembered fragments. Whispers shared by grandparents, fragments of warnings passed down without context, old stories retold so many times they blurred into superstition. But long before those stories reached their watered-down version, before fear turned to legend, Hollow Ridge was home to a group of people who called themselves the Ridgeborn clan. A community so secluded and shrouded in secrecy that even neighboring towns rarely saw them. They weren't reclusive by accident. The Ridgeborn believed isolation was necessary to preserve their rituals, their bloodline, and most of all, their sacred relationship with the land the rest of the county believed was cursed. According to early records, scattered diaries, old land agreements, and a few surviving census notes, the Ridgeborn settled in Hollow Ridge sometime in the late 1800s. No one knew where they came from. They simply appeared. Families with strange names and stranger customs, building cabins deep in the forest, where no outsiders dared to tread. It wasn't that they were hostile. It was simply that anyone who approached them returned uneasy, unable to explain what unsettled them. The Ridgeborn always spoke in low, melodic voices, their eyes reflecting a depth that felt almost ancient. Their language was a dialect that sounded vaguely European, but scholars could never pinpoint its origin. Yet for nearly 70 years they lived quietly, trading rarely, asking for nothing, offering little. And then, in the spring of 1959, they vanished. Their disappearance became one of the most baffling events in county history. When a group of loggers ventured too close to the Ridgeborn settlement and found an entire village abandoned, they expected signs of disease or violence, but the cabins were intact, Clothes hung from ropes as if drying. Meals sat unfinished on tables, bowls still warm to the touch. Doors were left open, tools scattered on the ground. A half-repaired roof waiting for someone to return to it. But no one ever did. Every family, every child, every elder, gone without footprints, without tracks, without a trace. Search teams combed the woods for weeks. Bloodhounds found nothing, no graves, no broken branches, no signs of relocation. It was as if the clan had dissolved into the air itself. The county sheriff declared it a mass migration gone wrong, despite having no evidence to support the claim. Locals whispered a darker theory, that the Ridgeborn had followed something into the forest, something they worshipped, something they believed would return. After the disappearance, Hollow Ridge became an off-limits region. The government placed unofficial restrictions on entering. Forestry researchers avoided mapping it, and the area grew untouched and increasingly dense. The old Ridgeborn cabins collapsed in on themselves over the years, swallowed by vines and moss, their roofs buried under decades of pine needles. The clan became a ghost story. Children used to scare one another, a name invoked by old residents when the weather turned strange, or when animals fled the woods for no visible reason. But the fear never died completely. Even the oldest residents admitted in quiet tones that Hollow Ridge felt wrong ever since the clan vanished, as if the forest itself knew something it wasn't willing to share. When the three children were found in 1968, barefoot, silent, oddly dressed, and speaking a language no one recognized, the county had no choice but to reopen the files abandoned 9 years earlier. Suddenly, old stories resurfaced reports that the Ridgeborn children had always been different, unusually perceptive, sometimes seen wandering the woods alone at night without flashlights, unafraid of the dark. Their elders claimed the children could hear the ridge, a phrase that never made sense until Samuel, Maria, and Lenny reported the strange low hum vibrating through the forest on the day of discovery. There were also the symbols, carvings found on trees, stones, and the wooden idols the Ridgeborn placed throughout the woods. Those symbols reappeared in 1968, matching the exact patterns etched into the hospital's walls by the smallest child after rescue. The deeper investigators dug, the stranger the history became. A set of old diaries from a county botanist in the 1930s described visiting the Ridgeborn village to document their herbal practices. In her notes, she wrote about the clan's fixation on the mountain caves located beneath the ridge, claiming the caves were the heart of their worship, and that the clan elders forbade her from entering. One line in her diary stood out. They believe the caves speak, not metaphorically. They believe an entity within speaks to the children and guides them. She never returned after that visit. Another disturbing detail emerged from a 1924 sheriff's report detailing a missing hunter who vanished near Hollow Ridge. When authorities searched his camp, they found his journal. The last entry read, "I saw children in the trees tonight, not standing on branches, standing on the vertical trunks, as if the trees held them." The sheriff dismissed the report as hallucination caused by hunger and exhaustion. Yet these accounts resurfaced again and again. Unexplained humming, children with unusual behaviors, symbols carved into surfaces with impossible precision, lights seen deep in the woods where no homes or paths existed. But all of these stories were brushed aside, unable to be proven, fading into hearsay, until 1959, when the Ridgeborn vanished, and again in 1968, when the children reappeared as if stepping out of another world. What troubled investigators the most wasn't their language or their appearance, but their condition. Medical evaluations revealed anomalies no one could explain. Their body temperature remained several degrees lower than normal, even when wrapped in blankets and warmed rooms. Their heart rates were abnormally slow, sometimes dropping to levels that should have rendered them unconscious. Their pupils reacted strangely to light, expanding even under bright bulbs, shrinking under dim ones, behaving opposite of human norms. Doctors initially suspected malnutrition or hypothermia, but the children's internal examinations showed neither. They were malnourished, yes, but not nearly enough to explain their strange physiological traits. Their blood work contained markers that confused every lab technician who tested them. Some proteins resembled those found in remote indigenous populations, while others seemed completely alien to known human genetics. When two linguists attempted to decode their speech, they discovered the language contained patterns, not random, but structured. It had grammar, rhythm, and repeating syllabic clusters. But what alarmed them most was the underlying tone. The linguists claimed the children's speech carried harmonic frequencies beneath the audible sound, as if their voices produced two layers at once, one human, one impossible to identify. Authorities searched for family members but found nothing. DNA comparisons showed no match to anyone in the county, not even to the few records that existed from the Ridgeborn population before 1959. Yet older townspeople swore the children looked identical to the Ridgeborn. Same dark eyes, same angular cheekbones, same unusually pale complexions. One elderly resident insisted the smallest boy resembled a child she used to see playing near the cabin fields in 1955. But that was impossible. If that child had survived, he would have been nearly 20 by 1968, not 8 or 9 as he appeared. This discrepancy led to a new theory, one that investigators whispered among themselves, but refused to put in official reports. That the children hadn't aged normally. That wherever they had been for the past 9 years, time hadn't passed for them in the same way it passed for everyone else. Meanwhile, deeper research into the Ridgeborn clan uncovered details previously dismissed as folklore. Stories claimed the clan performed annual rituals near the mountain caves. Not sacrifices, nothing violent, but ceremonies involving chants, symbols, and carvings placed around the woods. The chants they used matched almost perfectly the rhythm of the syllables the 3 children spoke in the hospital. But what they worshipped wasn't a god, spirit, or ancestor. According to scattered writings, they believed something lived inside Hollow Ridge, something old, something that communicated not through words, but through vibrations, sounds too low for ordinary people to hear. They called it shallow, a name eerily similar to the phrase the children spoke. Shalom. Researchers who interviewed the last surviving relatives of the Ridgeborn, distant cousins who left the clan generations earlier, revealed that the Ridgeborn were forbidden from ever leaving Hollow Ridge. They believed the land claimed them at birth and held them until death. If a Ridgeborn child wandered too far, elders escorted them back immediately. Outsiders interpreted this as paranoia, but according to the relatives, it was something else entirely. The elders believed the land listened, watched, and waited, and the children were more sensitive to it, almost attuned. Some believed the youngest among the clan could hear the hum beneath the soil, the same hum Maria and Lenny encountered in 1968. The more investigators studied the history, the clearer the pattern became. The Ridgeborn weren't afraid of something in the woods. They were in partnership with it. Their rituals, carvings, chants, avoidance of outsiders, and strict prohibition on leaving the land all suggested a community maintaining a fragile pact. A pact that something disrupted in 1959, and that disruption was connected to the children found 9 years later. One of the most chilling discoveries came from an old hunter's map dated 1932. It marked a deep cave system beneath Hollow Ridge and included a note scribbled in the corner. Voices. Children laughing, though none are there. Do not enter. The cave was never found again after 1959, as if it sealed itself or shifted underground. But the children discovered in 1968 drew the same cave structure repeatedly, sometimes dozens of times a day, with impossible accuracy, as though they had walked its halls only hours before. When investigators showed the drawings to the linguists, they noticed a repeating symbol near the entrance of the cave sketches, a shape identical to the wooden carving found in the clearing during the hikers' discovery. At that point, the county accepted the possibility. They had tried to avoid. The three children were not just survivors of the Ridgeborn clan. They were the only connection to understanding what had truly happened in 1959. Their language, their strange health, their drawings, their apparent fear of the hum in the forest, all pointed to one conclusion: the county was not prepared to face. The Ridgeborn didn't vanish because of starvation, migration, or disease. They weren't lost. They were taken, or they followed something. And the children who emerged in 1968 were the first clue. They didn't reappear by chance. They didn't wander into the woods accidentally. They returned because something brought them back. And whatever that something was, it wasn't finished. From the moment the three children, later identified only by the provisional names assigned to them in the hospital, were brought into the county medical ward, the staff sensed something was wrong. Not frightening, not supernatural, not dangerous. At least not at first impression. Just profoundly, unmistakably wrong in a way the human mind recognizes before logic catches up. They were quiet, too quiet for children their age. No questions, no crying, no resistance. They obeyed every instruction with a detached calm, as if their bodies responded automatically while their minds remained somewhere far away. Their eyes wandered the hospital rooms with unblinking curiosity, pausing occasionally on objects that emitted faint noise. Fluorescent lights, heart monitors, metal trays. The nurses dismissed this as disorientation, but the behavior persisted even after they were fed, warmed, and hydrated. What alarmed the medical team first was the children's skin temperature. When a nurse placed a hand on the smallest boy's arm, she recoiled immediately, convinced he had been lying in snow for hours. His skin was ice cold. The thermometer confirmed the impossible. His temperature hovered around 92 GFs, 33.3 GC, a reading consistent with mild hypothermia. Yet he showed none of the symptoms. No shivering, no fatigue, no slurred speech. All three children shared the same abnormal temperature, and all three seemed unaffected by it. Doctors warmed the room, wrapped them in heated blankets, placed them under heat lamps. Yet their temperatures refused to rise above the low threshold. When asked if they felt cold, the children responded with the same melodic phrase, spoken softly, almost rhythmically, as though reciting a prayer. None of the linguists could translate it, but several noticed the tone carried an unusual acoustic property. Each child's voice contained faint undertones, low vibrations that seemed almost too deep for small vocal cords to produce. The next anomaly appeared during the routine heart examinations. Their heart rates were astonishingly slow. The oldest child's pulse sat at 39 beats per minute, far below what would be considered dangerous for a child of his size. Yet again, he showed no distress. The middle child's heart rhythm occasionally paused, for nearly 5 seconds at a time, long enough to send the monitor into alarm mode, causing nurses to rush in expecting cardiac arrest. But every time they checked, the child was simply sitting upright, watching them with calm, patient eyes blinking slowly, as if the alarm bothered them more than the supposed medical emergency. At one point, one of the hospital interns asked the head physician if the monitors were malfunctioning. They checked. They weren't. The strangeness deepened when an ophthalmologist examined the children's eyes. Their pupils reacted backwards, shrinking in darkness and expanding in bright light, not by a small margin. The reaction was exaggerated, almost snapping open and shut with unnatural responsiveness. The doctor tested them repeatedly, switching lights rapidly, expecting fatigue or delayed reaction. But the children's pupils behaved consistently, adapting with mechanical precision to stimuli. No human eyes should interpret that way. The doctor later told investigators that when he leaned close to inspect the oldest child's eyes, he saw something he couldn't explain: reflections inside the pupil, as if the darkness held a sheen, a depth almost like looking into water filled with light, rather than a hollow black void. He withdrew immediately, shaken without knowing why. Stranger still was the children's sensitivity to certain sounds. The hospital was full of noises, heels clicking on tile, doors shutting, carts rolling, machines whirring. Yet none of those sounds bothered them. But when someone dropped a stainless steel bowl in the hallway, producing a loud metallic echo, all three children jolted violently as if struck by electricity. The youngest boy curled into a tight ball and covered his ears, rocking back and forth while speaking rapidly in the unknown language. The other two pressed themselves flat against the wall, trembling, but not in fear, more like reacting to pain. A neurologist later theorized they were hypersensitive to metallic resonance frequencies, possibly due to developmental differences, but the severity of their reaction hinted at something deeper, something primal. The children behaved not as though the sound startled them, but as though it threatened them. The hospital staff quickly learned to avoid sharp metallic noises, but their attempts to maintain a calm environment were appended 2 nights later when a technician wheeled a metal IV pole into the room. The pole squeaked faintly along the floor. The moment it made contact with the tile, the children went rigid. Their eyes widened, pupils dilating impossibly. Their heads snapped toward the hallway in perfect unison. And for the first time since their discovery, fear appeared on their faces. Not mild discomfort, not irritation, but deep instinctive terror. They stared at the IV pole as if it were a living predator. The technician froze, confused. Then the smallest child whispered one word in a trembling voice. The first time any of them had spoken without rhythm. No. The pole was removed immediately. Their panic subsided within seconds, replaced once again by eerie calm. Blood tests revealed even more strange results. Their hemoglobin levels were normal, as were most electrolytes. But their DNA showed anomalies that baffled every lab. Certain markers matched none of the known genetic profiles in the region. Others resembled markers found in isolated indigenous tribes studied decades earlier. And then there were markers that simply didn't fit anywhere. Patterns that shouldn't exist, sequences that didn't align with human chromosomes. The laboratory attempted multiple retests, convinced contamination had occurred. But each test produced the same data. One of the senior geneticists studying the samples reportedly muttered, "I don't know what these kids are, but they are not fully like us." It wasn't until the 4th night that the staff witnessed something that unsettled them deeply. At around 2:00 a.m., a nurse making her rounds noticed faint light flickering under the children's door. She assumed someone had left a lamp on, but when she opened the door, she froze. The children were awake, sitting cross-legged in a triangle on the floor, their hands resting on their knees. In front of them, drawn directly onto the tile with something that looked like charcoal, was a large symbol. Circular, intersected with geometric lines and small, repeating strokes resembling runes. It matched the markings found in the hollow ridge caves decades earlier. But that wasn't what frightened her. The light wasn't coming from a lamp. It was coming from the symbol itself. The charcoal lines glowed faintly, pulsing as though responding to an unseen heartbeat. The children were chanting softly, their voices layering on top of each other in 3 distinct pitches: high, medium, and low, creating vibrations that seemed to travel along the walls, making the room feel warmer and colder at the same time. The nurse stepped backward, unsure if she should call security or simply run. When she accidentally collided with the door frame and made a small metallic clink, the children stopped instantly. Their heads turned toward her in perfect synchronization, the glowing symbol fading immediately, their eyes locked on hers. Emotionless but alert, she stammered an apology, though she didn't know why she felt the need to apologize. The children said nothing. After a moment, they returned to their beds without complaint, lying down and closing their eyes, as though nothing unusual had happened. The nurse later reported the event, though her superiors quietly removed the written incident from the records. The next morning, the glowing symbol was gone, erased perfectly from the tiles without a single streak or smudge, as though the charcoal had never existed. The only proof was the nurse's trembling voice, as she tried to convince the staff she hadn't hallucinated the entire thing. A specialist in child psychology visited shortly after, attempting to connect with the children through pictures, toys, and gestures. He brought dolls, blocks, crayons, and picture cards depicting common objects: trees, animals, flowers. The children showed little interest until he placed a drawing of a deer on the table. All 3 reacted instantly, whispering in their language, touching the picture with trembling fingers. Their whispers grew faster, the tones rising and falling as if describing something urgent. When the psychologist turned the page to a drawing of a cave entrance, they recoiled violently. The smallest child pushed the picture away, his face twisting with distress. Then he pointed at the cave drawing and shook his head repeatedly, saying the same phrase again and again in a terrified voice. The psychologist noted the phrase phonetically as Orn Sharon, though no one knew what it meant. Later that afternoon, the oldest child took a crayon and began drawing on his own. At first glance, it looked like more cave systems, long tunnels, branching pathways, spiraling depths. But when the drawing was compared to old maps of Hollow Ridge, the resemblance was undeniable. He had drawn sections of the underground cave network with shocking accuracy, including areas never made public and believed to be forgotten. Exactly how a child supposedly living in the wilderness could map subterranean structures was beyond explanation. One of the neurologists conducted EEG tests on the children, expecting irregularities. What she found was even stranger. All of their brainwave patterns were synchronized. Not similar, synchronized, beating in unison like 3 instruments playing the same note. And whenever one child reacted to a sound or movement, the EEG spikes appeared in the other 2 children's charts simultaneously, even if they hadn't moved. It was as if the children shared a neurological connection, one that transcended physical interaction. More troubling was their reaction to silency. When the machines were turned off and the room fell quiet, the children became alert, almost anxious. They sat upright, heads tilted as though listening for something distant. Not something external, something internal. A vibration, a signal, a call. One evening, during a power outage caused by a local grid failure, the hospital hallways plunged into darkness. Emergency lights flickered on, casting long shadows. Within seconds, the children began whispering the same phrase repeatedly, their voices trembling, echoing faintly off the walls. A nurse approached to calm them. But when she entered the room, the temperature had dropped dramatically. Her breath formed clouds as she spoke. The children sat on their beds, eyes wide, as if waiting for something or someone to arrive. Then, unmistakably, from somewhere deep within the hospital, A low hum resonated through the floors. It lasted only a moment, but it was identical to the hum the hikers had heard in Hollow Ridge. The same subterranean vibration that seemed to come from beneath the earth itself. When the lights returned moments later, the children fell silent, lying down as though nothing had happened. The medical team didn't understand it then, but they documented everything. Every anomaly, every unexplainable behavior, every reaction that hinted the children were more connected to Hollow Ridge than to the world of humans. But the most disturbing discovery came on the 6th day, when researchers attempted to scan the smallest boy's brain using early MRI equipment. The moment the machine powered on, emitting its low-frequency magnetic hum, all 3 children screamed. Not cried. Screamed. Their bodies contorting as if the noise tore through their bones. The MRI tech shut the machine off immediately, horrified. When the children finally stopped screaming, they collapsed into a deep, unnatural sleep, their breaths shallow, their eyes rolled back. 2 hours later, when they awoke, they spoke a new phrase, one not yet documented. They repeated it again and again until the linguists managed to transcribe it. Shalom Naren. Shalom Naren. One of the older linguists, a woman who had studied tribal myths for years, whispered her own interpretation. Something calls them, something they fear, and something they belong to. But she was wrong. The children did not belong to it. They were made for it. And whatever it was coming. The investigation into the Hollow Ridge children had already drawn in more attention than the local authorities could manage, which is why the federal team was called in less than a week after the children were discovered. Officially, they were a special research division with expertise in anthropology, linguistics, and unexplained phenomena. Unofficially, they were a group the county sheriff referred to as the people you only see when something is deeply wrong. They arrived quietly, black vans rolling through the thin layer of fog at dawn, as if the forest had summoned them rather than the government. Their faces were stern, unmoved by the chatter of townsfolk who gathered to watch. They didn't take questions. They didn't give answers. They moved with a confidence that suggested they had witnessed things more disturbing than 3 silent, pale children whispering in an untraceable language. The children were moved from the county hospital into a secure research wing set up inside an old training facility at the edge of town. No one knew the details of what went on inside, but the locals noticed strange lights flickering through the small basement windows at night, and they swore they heard humming, deep, rhythmic, almost melodic, vibrating from the walls. Inside the facility, the investigators tried to communicate with the children, but all attempts were met with blank stares or sequences of whispered syllables none of the translators could decipher. One of the children, the youngest boy, had a habit of tilting his head sharply whenever anyone entered the room, as if listening not to footsteps but to the person's heartbeat or the air around them. Another, the girl, drew constantly. She filled papers with symbols, some jagged, some circular, some composed of perfect geometric precision, that seemed beyond the capacity of a malnourished child who had supposedly lived in the wilderness. One of the researchers, Dr. Helen Avery, became fixated on these symbols. She believed they were more than just drawings. They were messages, perhaps a form of record-keeping. She spoke to the children kindly, always using soft tones, but they never responded to her voice. Only when she accidentally knocked a metal tray against the wall one evening did the oldest boy lift his gaze abruptly, pupils widening into large glossy circles. The reaction startled her, and she made a note of it. She wrote that the children seemed to respond to vibrations more than to verbal attempts, something that would later prove critical. but was never followed up on. While half the team worked with the children, the other half focused on the caves surrounding Hollow Ridge. The caves had long been covered in folklore. Old residents told stories of strange lights disappearing into their depths, of distant chanting at odd hours, of animals refusing to go near them. The Ridgeborn clan, the vanished group from the 1950s, had always treated the caves as sacred ground. They had carved massive wooden markers around the entrances, decorated with runes, similar to those the little girl drew. The research team broke into two groups to map the caverns. Group A entered through the western opening. Group B chose a narrower, harder, to access passage on the northern slope. Only Group A returned. Group B consisted of 2 men, experienced, disciplined, and equipped with military-grade communication gear. Their names were recorded in the investigation log as Agent Marlowe and Agent Reading. Their last known position was inside the northern passage, about 40 meters past the entrance. They had set up a small tracking beacon which blinked for hours, sending periodic pulses to the surface. Then, sometime past midnight, the beacon stopped. Not gradually, not slowly. It simply blinked out, as if it had never existed. The communications officer on duty attempted to radio them. No answer. He tried their backup signal. Nothing. Static crawled across the receiver for a full minute before something else emerged from the noise. A low, pulsing hum. At first, it resembled the interference that occurs when frequencies overlap. But then, it deepened, stretching in waves that made the air in the room vibrate. And then came the whisper. It was faint, distant, but unmistakably a child's voice. Not just a single syllable, but a string of rhythmic patterns that matched the bizarre language the found children spoke. The officer froze. The voice repeated 3 times before dissolving back into the hum. Within the hour, alarms blared through the facility, and every available team member rushed toward the cave entrances. The sheriff tried to join them, but a federal officer stopped him with a single warning. This is no longer a local matter. Inside the cave, the air was colder than outside, unnaturally so. Frost coated the walls despite the mild weather. The lights the team carried flickered, as if struggling against an unseen force, and some of the equipment malfunctioned entirely. They found the first clue 30 meters in Agent Marlowe's radio, placed neatly on a flat rock, as though someone had set it down with intention. Not dropped, not abandoned in panic, deliberately placed. No footprints were visible except for the initial tracks leading in. Everything beyond that point was undisturbed, as though nothing had moved through the passage in decades. The investigators searched for hours, combing underground chambers and narrow crawl spaces. They called out the men's names until their voices cracked. The only answer was the dripping of mineral-laced water and the occasional flutter of unseen wings deeper in the dark. Eventually, the team commander ordered everyone out of the caves. He claimed it was due to structural instability. But the truth was simpler. Something inside those walls unnerved even the most seasoned investigators. When they returned to the facility, the children, the ones they were supposedly keeping under strict observation, were found standing quietly outside their locked room. All 3, barefoot, facing the hallway, as if waiting for the investigators to come back. And they were humming, the exact same hum that had come through the missing agent's radio. Panic rippled through the team, though the official reports later softened the language. The children were returned to their room, though how they got out remained unexplained. The guards insisted no one had opened the door. The electronic lock showed no signs of tampering. The footage from the corridor camera glitched during the exact 5-minute window the children appeared outside. Those 5 minutes were lost forever. After the disappearance of the investigators, The federal team became more desperate. They ran more tests on the children. They analyzed the cave ruins with intensified urgency. They brought in additional personnel. But the more they studied, the more the pieces refused to fit into anything logical. One audio expert isolated a frequency inside the hum the children produced, a frequency humans shouldn't have been able to create with their vocal cords. Another researcher discovered that some of the girls' drawings matched carved symbols found deep inside the northern passage. Carvings too ancient to match the known history of any clan or tribe in the region. Meanwhile, townsfolk near the ridge reported hearing the same hum late at night. Sometimes it came from the forest, sometimes from the direction of the caves. Sometimes, most unsettling of all, from beneath the ground near their homes. As fear spread, the federal team made a decision that changed everything. They were going to relocate the children to a classified facility out of state. They believed the forest itself might be influencing them, especially after the cave incident. The transfer was scheduled for just after midnight, but they never made it to the vans. Minutes before the transfer, every device in the facility went dead. Lights flickered, then failed. Radios cut out. Monitors collapsed into black screens. The emergency generator kicked on, then immediately shut itself off. In the sudden darkness, dozens of people reported hearing it. The hum, louder than ever, echoing through the ventilation system, the floors, the walls, even the air itself. Some claimed they heard voices layered beneath it. A chorus of whispers, speaking the same language the children used. The investigators scrambled to find flashlights. Someone shouted for the guards. Someone else yelled that the children's room was open again. And then came the flash. A blinding white burst of light that surged through the facility, so bright that several people dropped to the ground, covering their eyes. The light lasted only a second, but the silence afterward was heavier than any darkness. When the power finally returned, the children were gone. The lock on their door was intact. The windows were still sealed. No alarms had been triggered. No guards had seen a thing. It was as if the children had simply dissolved into the light. The official report stated they had escaped custody, though no explanation was given as to how 3 barefoot, malnourished children could vanish from a sealed room in a building full of federal agents. The disappearance of Agents Marlowe and Reading, the blackout, and the final flash were all categorized as unresolved anomalies. The caves were sealed off by government order. The town was ordered not to speak to reporters, but rumors continued. Some claimed they still heard the hum in the forest. Others said they saw 3 small silhouettes wandering the ridge on moonless nights. A few swore the children were never human to begin with. And somewhere in a locked federal archive far from Hollow Ridge, a single audio recording sits in a classified file. It is the last transmission from the missing investigator's static, the hum, and the soft, unmistakable voice of a child whispering in the dark. The days following the disappearance of the Hollow Ridge children were marked by an uneasy quiet that settled over the entire county like a heavy, suffocating fog. People tried to go about their daily routines, but the forest seemed to breathe differently, as though something deep within its shadows had awakened. The federal agents who remained in the town refused to answer any questions, speaking only in clipped instructions and warning the sheriff to limit civilian access to the ridge. But these were people who had lived their whole lives beside that forest. People who knew every swell of its ground, every call of its wildlife, every rustle of its branches. They felt the change long before the federal team did. And some of them whispered among themselves at night that the forest was no longer just a place. It was listening. The first strange incident occurred 3 days after the blackout. Mrs. Eleanor Green, a widow who lived in a small cabin near the foot of Hollow Ridge, claimed she heard the laughter of children outside her window at 2:00 in the morning. Not joyful laughter, but the slow, rhythmic kind, like a chant shaped into giggles. She peeked through the curtains, but saw nothing except the tall trees, swaying without wind. The next night, a farmhand working late on the outskirts of town swore that the ground beneath his feet vibrated as though a heartbeat pulsed deep under the soil. He described it to the sheriff as a slow, deliberate thump, like something enormous breathing underground. The sheriff dismissed the claims but felt a knot in his stomach. He had heard the audio from the missing agent's last transmission. That hum was something he would never forget. The tension only grew when wildlife began to behave erratically. Deer wandered into town in broad daylight, trembling as if fleeing from some unseen predator lurking beyond the tree line. Flocks of birds that typically migrated south suddenly began circling over the ridge instead, forming spiraling shapes that resembled symbols the girl had drawn in the research facility. Dogs barked at empty corners of rooms. Cats hissed at shadows that didn't move. Every creature seemed to sense a shift in the natural order of things. By the 5th night, the town was on edge. Parents kept their children indoors. Windows were shut. Doors were barred. The local diner, usually busy with hunters and hikers, became a quiet gathering place where people exchanged wary glances instead of stories. Some believed the forest was cursed. Others insisted the children were alive. Changed, but alive. But no one dared to go near the ridge to find out. Then, at exactly 9:47 p.m., every light in Hollow Ridge flickered once. A sharp pop echoed through the air, and all electrical power in a 3-mile radius went dead. Not gradually, instantly. Porch lights, radios, street lamps, televisions, flashlights, generators. Everything failed simultaneously. Across town, people stepped to their windows, confused. Some mildly annoyed. Others paralyzed with dread, because most of them recognized the pattern. This was exactly how the blackout at the research facility had begun. A split second later, the hum began. It rolled through the air like a living thing, swelling through the treetops and spreading into the roads with a resonance that made windows tremble in their frames. It wasn't loud, but it was impossible to ignore. It vibrated in bones and teeth, in the spaces between heartbeats. Children awoke screaming, covering their ears. Dogs cowered beneath beds. Livestock kicked at their stalls. The adults tried to rationalize it. Maybe a transformer had blown. Maybe some machine deep in the forest had malfunctioned. But deep down, every single one of them knew better. The sound was the same one recorded on the missing agent's radio. The same one the children had hummed with eerie precision. And now the entire town could hear it. The sheriff grabbed his keys and radio, which, of course, was dead, and raced toward the ridge with 2 deputies. They drove in silence, headlights cutting through the darkness, the hum growing louder with every passing second. When they reached the edge of the forest, the hum abruptly stopped. Not faded, stopped, as if someone had flipped a switch. The silence that followed was even more unsettling than the sound. The deputies exchanged worried glances, but the sheriff stepped out of the vehicle, determined to at least reach the foot of the caves. He didn't get far. A blinding flash erupted from deep within the ridge. It wasn't lightning. There were no clouds. It wasn't a flare. There was no smoke. It was a pure white light that poured from the trees in a perfect wave, illuminating every branch, every stone, every shadow. It was brighter than anything the sheriff had ever seen. Brighter than headlights, brighter than the sun, brighter than the flash at the facility. The forest lit up as if someone had pressed pause on reality itself, freezing the world in a single impossible burst. The sheriff shielded his eyes, but through the glare, he saw something, three small silhouettes, standing at the tree line.